in a second. Oh, all right. Good evening, everyone. Hope you're well. Hope you're. Oh God. Oh, oh. Pardon me. There is a lizard right outside my window, and I'm petrified of them. I'm so sorry. Let's do that again. Hope you're well. Hope you're staying safe. My name is Neil Nagwekar. Hope there are no lizards outside your window. I am project lead for the Homemaker series at tellmeastory.biz. That's tellmeastory.biz. And welcome to the last session of the Homemaking Talk series. We have come quite a way. It has been quite a journey. We began the homemakers from the individual, not necessarily the housewife, not necessarily the maid. We began with any individual. We moved on to family, then communities, then representation, and then the country. Today, in fact, our last session was with the corporate heads of Aether, Infosys, and NTPC Limited, where we closed the book on India, the country. Today is our last session, and we will try to explore the world. Our session for today is called Homemakers of the World, Exploring a Utopic and Conflictless Society. A reminder that this is the last day to submit your poems and short stories for the Homemaker Amazon Kindle ebook. So I think we have 4 hours or so to do that. Without further ado, let's get to the panel. Let me introduce our panelists for today. First up, we have Professor Sangeetha Menon. Good evening, Sangeetha. I hope I'm audible. Sangeetha Menon is Sangeetha Menon is the Dean for the School of Humanities at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in the IIS campus in Bangalore, India. At NIAS, she is the professor and the head of the Consciousness Studies program. Her latest books, published by Springer Nature, are Brain, Self and Consciousness, Explaining the Conspiracy of Experience, and the edited volume Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Consciousness and the Self. That is Professor Sangeetha. Next up, we have Dr. Anway Mukhopadyay. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Dr. Anway is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Kharagpur, West Bengal. Previously, he was an assistant professor at Banaras Hindu University, or BHU, and at the University of Gurdwara. His works have been cited and discussed by reputed scholars in celebrated international journals published by Sage, Taylor and Francis, Springer, and Cambridge University Press. He has published 2 books of creative writing as well, in fiction and in poetry. Normally we tend to have 3 panel members for discussions like these, but I think this is going to be a really deep, abstract, and perhaps philosophical talk here. So I think it makes sense to restrict it to 2 speakers and have a more in-depth analysis of the way things are right now. The topic for today is exploring a utopic and conflictless society, or rather a utopic and conflictless world. So let's start to question the assumptions behind the title here. The first question I'd like to ask our panelists is, we are here to explore a utopic and conflictless society, but what is conflict itself, and how is conflict generated? What is the source of conflict?
So we begin with Sangeetha ji, I guess. So she
Yeah.
may give her opinion and then I will come.
Yeah, so thank you for resolving that conflict, Anway. Well, I guess that is what it is. So conflicts are sometimes very simple juxtapositions, contexts, where the options are very clear, but we wouldn't know which one to opt for. So because both are equally valuable, both are equally valid, and both are equally interesting, but then how do I choose one? So I would think conflict basically is that it's a very simple human experience, but it is too simple that it's very complex to engage with it. I think I'll stop there. I guess that's not too abstract, I hope, because I took the example which I think Neil Nagwekar gave us.
Yeah.
Yes, Anway. Yeah.
So thank you. So I personally believe that when we talk about conflicts, actually we have to talk about the multiple dimensions of conflict. For instance, when we talk about conflict as such, we often tend to confuse one kind of conflict with another. For instance, we often tend to see conflict as essentially connected with violence, but that need not be the case actually. For instance, there might be differences in opinion, which might be expressed in respectful way with mutual respect. Then you can also express the same ideas, the differences in terms of worldviews, differences in terms of ideologies in a very violent and aggressive way. So what we need to really look at is the distinction that one can probably make between, on the one hand, the points of the generation of conflict, which are very natural. In fact, if we say that there should be a completely conflictless society, then probably, we are not just imagining a happy utopia. So I will come to that later on as well. And if you think about the philosophical dimensions of this issue, you will find that there are many thinkers who are in fact encouraging conflict. They are talking about agonistic democracy. For instance, William Connolly is talking about that. Then Shatan Muffe is talking about that. They are actually saying that it's wrong to believe that there should be one singular or universal perspective as far as our social epistemologies are concerned. We should rather think about how to negotiate with multiple perspectives, and we should rather encourage a kind of agonistic relationship between them, some kind of conflict. But yes, we also need to look at the communicative dimension of conflict. So there might be conflict, but how do you communicate it? Do you communicate in the way, the panelists, say on various TV channels, communicate it every day? Which are sometimes very horrifying, or should we communicate it in the way we are trying to do that today? So it's also about the expression of the points of conflict, and not just about the generation of conflict within a society, or even within at the micro level of the interpersonal relationships.
This is odd to me because sorry.
Yeah, I thought I can chip in a little bit, Neil, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm still wondering your very clear question. How do you define, or what is conflict? I think I'm a little stuck with that very simple question, but opens up a whole lot of experiential complexity. So if you try to define, it depends upon who is defining it. Am I defining it as an individual representative of the human species? Am I defining it as a representative of maybe a little larger collective? I don't know what that could be. So this can go on and on in a galactic, with a galactic order. But even if you keep it, let us say, come back and say as a representative of the human species, and particularly so important that we are discussing it today, where the major conflict is between the human existence and the microbial existence. And so I think, sorry?
Uninitiated, could you sort of elaborate on that point?
I'm unable to follow what you're saying.
For the people who don't understand the difference between individual and microbial, people like me, could you explain that a little bit more?
Well, the microbial is just the microbial existence, microorganisms. So, human is a mammal in the evolutionary scale. So, and the virus is a microbial existence. So basically, we are talking about the pandemic. So it depends upon, again, who is defining and what is defining conflict and what for. Because conflict also immediately gives you a little negative or a challenge with it, which means something has to be shared, and it is a bit difficult to share equally or let us say with absolutely no impediment in the sharing. So conflict also brings you therefore the concept of sharing, I would think, because it is conflict in sharing resources, conflict in sharing emotions, conflict in sharing a larger worldview. And this is very important, particularly if at all we are bringing in philosophy, that we have to look into the idea of conflict as a methodological possibility, as well as an experiential complexity. So it depends upon, again, so as I think Neil Nagwekar's starts with, it's very important. How do we understand conflict? What is conflict? Do we already come with a loaded idea about conflict? Because why I'm saying this, and I'll stop in a minute. Why I say is one another word, perhaps, which people are quite a bit using in today's world. Of course, it started earlier, is binary. So binary is seen as a dual, and both of which is not going together. For example, in the mind-body area, philosophy of mind and philosophy of science, or consciousness studies, there are several binaries. Mind-body is a binary, and body consciousness is a binary, and brain-mind is a binary. So a conflict can be when there are two equally important entities and both have equally important functions, and when there is a tendency to reduce it to one. So therefore, the question also comes, is conflict something which is created by the structure, the infrastructure of human thinking itself? So there need to be critique about the idea and the concept which we design, such as conflict. I'm sorry for being so long. See, this is the problem if you call a philosopher. One philosopher speaks, the other philosopher will continue.
I think that is very much part of the rationale of getting two people, because I do think you should feel completely free to talk for hours if you want to, because this is a big, deep topic, and I'm sure we're going to raise more questions than we're going to get answered. One thing that struck me is when Sangeetha ma'am said that, or maybe sort of alluded to the fact that conflict is sort of inherent to the mind, and even Anway sir said that we should encourage conflict, or some schools of thought say that we should encourage conflict. So this sounds like an attempt to go away from a conflictless society and to sort of welcome the fact that there are conflicts on planet Earth. How do you ensure that the conflicts remain while also not, causing wars or violence in the typical understanding of the word conflict?
Yeah, but maybe I'll just quickly respond to your question, and then I think Dr. Anway can take up that. I'm not sure whether the ending of conflict is the immediate step, because we have not even started to understand where is the beginning of conflict. See, when there is a loaf of bread with me, and I have a companion who has not eaten for 1 week, and I have not eaten for 2 days, it's pretty much clear who would that bread will be entitled to whom, right? So which means, again, that's what I thought, at least to my mind, when we talk about conflict, it is sharing in terms of resources, or to begin with, food, because food is something which we have to begin with. Then only I can even talk about conflict, right? So it depends upon what we are talking about. It can be food, it can be the space, and the space can be just the geospatial space. I mean, just the space to stay and live and own or belong to, etc., etc., which means goes to a house, to a society, to a state, to country, and so on, so on. And of course, these have also geopolitical implications about space. And the third is space for the mental space, the psychological space. So that's why sometimes people say, see, I just cannot think. I'm not able to think because there's too much around me, or there are too many people around me. Or people say, oh, you please be here. When you are here, I'm able to think very clearly. Or you might say, can you give me a break, because I'm not able to think clearly. So which means even there is a conflict which we experience in our mind, in a psychological space as well. So conflict is a real entity in terms of, to come to the very simple, to the simpler or the most important facets of our existence, such as food, to space to live, space to think, and space to be. So the question, I think, is, can we all just be without getting eaten up by the forces of what we just described as the different kinds of conflict? We don't even want to think about or start even discuss about the conflicts in Afghanistan, the Afghan women, what they are going through, right? So yeah, so if we are bringing it philosophically, I would think this is one concept which also has a psychological side to it, and also a very deep existential side to it, which caters not only to your bodily existence but your political existence, and also your need to exist as a collective, as a community, which goes beyond the body, mind, and the geopolitics of your identity and space. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you, Sangeetha ji. Actually, many of the things that Sangeetha ji just said would also have resonances, what I am going to say. For instance, this issue of inner conflict. And this is a very important issue because, whenever we talk about conflict, we often tend to dissociate the societal dimension from the psychological dimension. But we actually need to relate them together. And if you look at the discipline of peace studies, you will find that this discipline is trying to reorient the definition of peace in new ways. And it's not just a kind of epistemological intervention, it's something which is also reflected in the policy shifts of the UNESCO. So I'm going to talk about that very soon because the issues that Professor Menon has just raised are very important in the context of rethinking peace and conflict. For instance, we need to think about the basic rights, right? Now, right at one level sounds very highfalutin, philosophical, but at another level, it's about the sheer preconditions of your material existence. For instance, without food, I can't live. Without shelter, I can't have my basic physical security. Without medicine, especially in times of a pandemic, we know how medicine, vaccines, and here we also need to think about the global inequality because we are talking about the global perspective of homemaking. So we need to understand how the global structures of cultural, political, and economic transactions are imbued with certain, ethos of inequality, so to speak. And without addressing that, you can't actually talk about peace. So long as there is this systemic inequality, there is going to be conflict. And even if there is peace in a society which is not just, which is thriving on inequality, then within that society, you are not going to have what is called positive peace or just peace. So here I would like to intervene with the perspectives of peace studies. For instance, if you think about Johan Galtung's idea of positive peace, where he's saying that when we talk about peace, we often tend to see it as something negative. Absence of war, absence of conflict, absence of violence. But he says that we need to understand that there is a difference between some kind of conspicuous eruption of violence and the systemic violence that is ingrained in a society, which often goes unnoticed. So without taking into account that systemic violence, that systemic injustice, you can't actually talk about peace in a positive way. So peace is not just absence of conflict, but it must in itself have a value. And that value can be generated only when you ensure that people have their basic rights. And similarly, John Ledrock is talking about just peace. Okay, so justice and peace, justice, injustice, and conflict. These things should be brought together in our discussion over conflict and peace. This is one. And then let's come to this notion of inner conflict. This is actually a very interesting issue because if you look at the global tensions, or rather the tensions which are visible at the global scale, most often we tend to think that certain things are global problems, but if you look deeply into them, you will find that probably they're assuming a global scale, but they are not really global problems. Probably they are politically specific problems which are due to certain political contingencies spreading worldwide. Something of that sort is happening. Now, when you look at that, you will find that most often, social tension or social conflict also emerges from inner conflict. For instance, here I recall Orhan Pamuk's novel Snow, which is actually a very interesting document of how this kind of inner instability within a culture or within certain modes of self-perception can lead to certain forms of fundamentalism. Right. So most often we think that fundamentalism is all about stable fundamentals. But if you look deeply into it, you will find that most often it's actually the opposite of that. It's not about the fundamentals, but rather, it's about the instability that one feels vis-a-vis the fundamentals. And that's why I think here it's very interesting to look at the quarrels, the inner quarrel and the outer quarrel that the poet William Butler Yeats talked about, for instance. And he talked about rhetoric and poetry both being related to quarrel. So on the one hand, you are quarreling with the others, and on the other hand, you are in conflict with yourself. So there is an inner quarrel going on. So, and that's why when we talk about stability, when we talk about peace, especially sustainable peace, probably we need to look at the inner conflict first, and then probably we can move over to the others. Of course, there is this issue of social inequality which one has to address. You can't escape this. But apart from that, this issue of inner instability or inner conflict is also very important, because somehow it's related to social conflict. If you yourself are deprived of a peaceful mental ecology or psychological ecology or the ecology of mind, as Gregory Bateson and the others have pointed out, if you don't have that kind of ecology, then naturally you are finally going to disturb the social ecology as well, and finally lead to the disturbance in the global ecology, if we can take this metaphor of the oikos. And here I would stop by referring to one particular binary, since Mr. Menon has talked about binaries, and that's a very interesting point here. You will find that as far as political thinking is concerned, one fundamental binary which actually emerged in ancient Greece, but which the entire Western civilization has actually worked with, and we have also adopted it. That is the binary of the oikos and the polis, right? So the political sphere and the private sphere. Now, the basic problem is that this binary is extremely dangerous, because the moment you differentiate between the polis and the oikos, it has obvious gender implications, and that was there in ancient Greece. For instance, women were relegated into the domestic space, and it was supposed that politics would be men's affairs. So there was obviously this gender corollary of this binary, a very problematic gender corollary. But apart from that, it's also problematic in that when you distinguish between these two things, you are actually trying to say that the political sphere can't become like an oikos. As it were, it should always be the space of agon. It should always be the space of what Claudio Colaguri calls the agon culture. Okay, so he says that there is a kind of agonal rationality which drives us, and which drives the Western society as a whole. And this has its kind of at least one of its originary points can be traced back to the culture of ancient Greece, because there you had this agon. Agon, of course, had other connotations as well. For instance, there were sports and all these things. But nevertheless, that was very much part of the political imagination. But if you say that the agonistic sort of orientation is going to constitute politics, then you are altogether, blocking any possibility of a political ecology. The political sphere becoming an oikos for the people who inhabit that sphere.
The image that I get when the comparison of oikos or the home is made with an entire political sphere, an entire polis, is that it's like this one big, not homogeneous, not at all homogeneous, but maybe some kind of pluralistic unity, and it's all this big community-oriented space where everyone's getting along with each other. But I think that the last 3 centuries, and let me bring up the dreaded C word here, capitalism, has ensured that we are becoming much more individualistic. We're sort of very much going away from that way of life where we all want to be this together in this one tribe or in this one, the scouts land or something like that. So how would you reconcile the fact that we may need to get into a community oriented life with the very real fact that everyone wants their own home, everyone wants their own car, everyone wants their own mug these days? How do you reconcile these two realities?
Do you want me to respond, Neil, or?
So there is no buzzer, no one needs to clap. Anyone can talk. You all can interrupt me if you want.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. And where you want to go ahead, or I mean,
No, please go on. Please go on. I will come to it. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think if I understood what you're asking is, can we be more community oriented and less individual focused? If I understood that question. Uh, See, I'm very fond of analytic philosophy. So, analytic philosophy really tries to understand the concept before explaining it. So, my thinking would be, is there really someone called an individual? Because, however much we try to understand an individual based on individual scores, you see a lot of collective sides in him. For example, our body has inherited from our parents. So basically, it is your genetic history which you are living in, which with some of the genes preferring to express and some of the genes not preferring to express, and they are passed on to the next generation. And so, really, I don't know whether there's an individual. And I like seeing movies, watching movies. I'm remembering this Castaway, which I think almost all of us would have seen the movie Castaway. There, Tom Hanks befriends with a soccer ball. And I'm assuming the story is known to all, so I'm not giving you a narrative on the story. But in his utter dejection of the entire world and being trapped in an island, he wanted some companion and he wanted someone to talk with. And so he found this soccer ball, and soccer ball was his friend till the very end. So our need to talk, just as we are talking now and this talk show, we need to talk, right? I need to talk to you, you need to talk to me, we need to talk to someone. So this need to talk itself is very contradictory to the idea that we are individuals. I really don't think there are individuals, quite frankly. So, but then you might ask, really? How is that possible? Because every day there is fight because there are individuals. I think the fight is not because not because we don't see more than just a body mind entity. It is because we are unable to relate to the other possibilities of the human existence. And so, what is, I think, qualified by the Anthropocene scenario which we are facing, it is not just being too much human, but I think it is being too less of a human. I really would like to put it in the other way, because this is the golden opportunity in the evolutionary order as a species for us. Look at the magnificent qualities which we have, the abilities which we have, which are psychosocial, and we are not even able to understand how this happens. For example, empathy. So I'm assuming some of you might be watching The Money Heist, this famous Netflix serial. So there Berlin is described as one who has no empathy. And if you remember, the script continues. He doesn't know how to distinguish between right and wrong. So basically, the ability to see what is right and wrong is also decided by our ability to be really knowing the other person as the other person is. And it is extremely difficult. And I'm giving you a theoretical stance now. And I know that it is not that, I'm so empathic. I try to be empathic as much as possible. But then it's not easy, because we are wired in such a way that some of our selfish genes, the heads of those selfish genes get up and say, no need of that much empathy. Because, so there is, what I'm trying to say is, there is this another conflict between selfishness and altruism, which is basically what Neil Nagwekar, I think, tried to pose in his question, the individual versus community. So altruism is all about community, and selfishness is all about individual. But then, realistically speaking, I don't think there is an existence for an individual by himself or herself, because he or she is all hardwired by the community for generations, for historical times. So, so how does an individual move towards more towards a community? A lot of reflection, I would think. What we are now doing, that we need to do that more often, which means the ability to reflect upon our sheer existence. What are we? That question, I think, is very, very important. And it is not just a philosophical question. I mean, because so many people have asked, right? So many people have asked. I mean, you look at Greek philosophy, you look at Upanishadic philosophy, you look at Chinese philosophy, all over the world, people have asked. But still, it looks like that question will never have an answer. Because that is why, in spite of pages after pages being written, or in spite of PDFs after PDFs being published, because today these days are all electronic papers, so you cannot talk only about a paper print, because it's all open source publishing. So in spite of that, it looks like we don't have an answer for that, because that is a puzzle. That is a puzzle to distract us. It's not a puzzle to give you an answer. It is to distract us, to show you another scenario where there is a wonderful possibility for the human mind to understand something which is beyond the nature of human mind as we think today, which is a very selfish. I'm not using the word selfish in any derogatory manner, but maybe perhaps in a more evolutionary biology oriented, as a very selfish, survival oriented entity. And such an entity is always in conflict with a community, because a community is more of an abstract entity, and it is the other. And the other is always in conflict with the self. But then that is where I think the puzzle stays, because it is from the individual we understand what is the nature of the self. So if you would ask me what is one of the most important questions for science, which is both natural sciences and social sciences, it is the nature of self. Because it is the nature of self, that particular reflection, which is going to create a transformation in our consciousness and to move with courage. Because a lot of courage is needed for that shift, because that shift is very, very existentially disturbing. But then, if you are able to accept that kind of an existential disturbance, I think there are a lot of beautiful gardens which we can visit after that, such a disturbing space. Yes. Anyway, I hope I didn't give a speech.
Thank you. So, when we talk about these issues, actually, these are very fraught issues. As far as I am concerned, I mean, I personally always, oscillate between these two poles, and this is actually a very significant locus of conflict as far as philosophical thought is concerned, right? So, whether you place the individual at the center of your thinking, or you place society at the center of your thinking. Now, when you take these two positions to the extreme, you find that both are equally problematic positions. Okay, so on the one hand, you have atomic individualism, which is extremely problematic. And to simplify matters, let me just put it in this way. So on the one hand, you have the capitalist hell, and on the other hand, you have the socialist hell, which is in many ways, relatable to the Nazi kind of philosophy as well. That you have to do everything for the society, and you can just go to hell. Now the problem is that we know very well, and this is a kind of intuitive perception that we have. We know from our intuitive faculty very well that both union and separation, both isolation and togetherness are important as far as the human well-being is concerned. And this is the central conflict, the central dialectics of human life. And many philosophers have expressed this in different ways. There are multiple, complex topological frameworks that the philosophers have used. For instance, on the one hand, you have Heidegger, who is talking about both the home and mobility across different existential possibilities. On the other hand, you have someone like Otto Rank who is talking about the necessity for separation from one's earlier self, but at the same time he's also talking about the necessity for union with the others. And we all know that, and that's what we were discussing at the beginning of this session as well. That sometimes we say, let me be alone. I want to be alone because I want to have some space for myself. And at other points, so we say that loneliness is it's like a hard rock, which is sitting on me, and I want to get out of my lonely sphere. So I want to communicate with the others, and you will find that this is actually beautifully sort of presented in the Upanishadic philosophy, where we have this notion of sa ekaki naiva reme. So the ultimate
What is that notion? I didn't quite hear that. What notion did you say?
Saha ekaki naiva reme. So he never, finds pleasure when he's alone. So that's the idea. So now, and that's precisely the idea that Aurobindo takes from the Upanishadic philosophy. His take is different.
Anwayji, there is also a very problematic Upanishadic statement. Atmanastu kamaya sarvam priyam bhavati. Which basically, So that is why it again depends upon how do you understand self. So when Yajnavalkya uses that particular stance to explain to Maitreyi what is the nature of the self.
Exactly.
Otherwise, because otherwise, why would one love another person? It's a very, very important question.
Exactly, and some people have said that it's actually about the reflection of the self in the others, which is basically a cynical person might interpret that statement by Yajnavalkya even as a kind of narcissistic orientation, that I see myself in everyone else and that's why I love them. But I'm not getting into that for the time being. So let me stick to this particular point. So this primordial desire to come out of some kind of primordial solitude, which constituted the universe, and this is a trope which has featured in Indian philosophy time and again. So in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, for instance, you have this notion of Radha coming out of Krishna because Krishna wanted to be two. So this idea that so whenever we talk about Indian mysticism, we often tend to talk about oneness, everything becoming one, and so on and so forth. But you will find that there is actually a two-way traffic that is being figured here. So on the one hand, it is being suggested that the divine wants to become two and then many. So and it's also stated in Upanishad that the divine or whatever, the absolute wanted to become many, multiplicitous. But the interesting point is that here there is actually a catch, and that is between one and many, there is the two. And this focus on the two is the most interesting thing as far as the Sanskrit language is concerned. I mean, this is how I see it. Of course, it's my own opinion. But it's very interesting where you have the dvivachana. So in English, you can say one person, two persons. But in Sanskrit, you have a dvivachana where you talk about two people, two entities. Now, this is very interesting because when we talk about plurality, we often tend to talk about plurality in terms of abstractions, right? So plural society, multiplicity, so many people, society, unified community, nation, global community, global citizenship, all these are very abstract ideas. And the basic problem with them is that this kind of abstraction is not concretely perceivable. But when you talk about two, for instance, if you take the example of romantic love, now that is a point where you can either love someone selfishly or you can exercise your altruism at that level. So both things are possible. So on the one hand, it's possible that you are willing to sort of impose your will on the beloved person. On the other hand, it's also possible that you are trying to establish a truly mutually fulfilling and fruitful intersubjective relationship. So this issue, this issue of plurality, singularity, or whatever, I think when we bring in this concrete notion of doing something together, where two people are involved, and this often happens. We know that. That even when we talk about our most intimate relationships, we find that it's not just an individual relationship, but rather it's something which is co-created, as it were, right? So even when you think about the trope of homemaking, Homemaking is actually not the job of an individual. It is a process of co-creation, or what bracketing would call co-poesis. So two people are coming together, at least two people. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that just two, because that is also an exclusionary kind of structure. But at least two people should come together and should engage in a concrete process of being together in order to create, a home. And that's why I think when we talk about the conflict binary of selfishness and altruism, we need to begin with certain concrete instances. If we find these instances, this is one thing. And secondly, uh, mm, whether the individual exists or not, we really don't know. I mean, in philosophical terms, in biological terms, there are multiple perspectives on this issue, multiple possible perspectives on this issue. But as I said, as far as the practical political outcome of this line of thinking is concerned, too much individualism and too much, probably what we might call anti-individualism are both problematic. Both are equally repressive. So some kind of middle ground has to be cut between them.
Let's talk about this middle ground more. I think we're past the 40-minute mark here, so we should start to wrap up here. I'd like to get your detailed thoughts on this one last question that occurred to me as I heard you guys. One thing that came to me was that things like communication, empathy, being together, learning to tolerate each other in a sense is important to a society with no violence. But let's talk about this line now. Where does this line of empathy remain? Because can I really empathize with someone who I just do not believe on at any level? If am I supposed to empathize with a pedophile, a cannibal, a Nazi who hates my entire race or class structure and wants me exterminated? So, where do we find this line of tolerance? I'm reminded of, I think, could be Karl Popper, who says that if there is a society of tolerant people and there's this one intolerant bloke, a tolerant society by its definition has to tolerate the existence of this intolerant bloke. But the intolerant bloke wants the extermination of all the tolerant. So you're sort of caught in this vicious cycle. How do we transcend from this cycle, really? Is my final question, and y'all can take as much time as you want. After that, we will wrap up.
Yeah, I think I may need a little bit of time, so I will respond first. I'm not sure empathy can be completely translated to just tolerance. Empathy is basically trying to see what the other person is going through. You may not tolerate it. You can run away from it. You don't have to be there. But so I would think empathy, apart from being a very deeply psychological phenomenon, it's also an epistemological method which helps you understand what's going on around you, which needs a lot of patience, which needs a lot of detachment from oneself and the experiential world which is surrounding you. But you asked a very pertinent question, Neil Nagwekar, that can I be tolerant towards a rapist, towards another social psychopath, a sociopath there? Well, this is a question which I have asked many, many times, because particularly when you see, I'm not saying that atrocities against men is less, painful than what is to women, but then you see this recent phenomena against some of the atrocities which women have experienced. Globally, you take Afghanistan, or take Mumbai, or take Andhra Pradesh, where different women have undergone very different kinds of pain, questioning their identity, they're questioning their existence and life itself. So how do you tolerate people who create such situations for people? Well, that is where we have a justice system. And it's very, very interesting. I think the whole discipline of jurisprudence it gets very complex because there's a lot of philosophical embeddedness in the idea of justice. Often we think of retributive um, justice to be the best sort of justice, because you cannot understand why would someone have to go through that atrocity, right? I mean, I'm particularly talking about rapists, or I mean, we are not talking about robbery or petty theft here, right? We are talking about thieving the life from a person, the dignity from a person. So, how do we really, respond to that? So, retributive justice is really basically taking your life. If you took my life, I'm sure going to a system will take your life. And so, what is the scope for that? But then the question is, what is the agenda behind retributive justice? The agenda behind retributive justice is to vanquish our own vengefulness, our own anger, and our own utter frustration to live in a world where to see someone is going through a pain which she or he doesn't deserve at all. But then this is absolutely justifiable. But then the problem there is that agenda, as you rightly asked earlier, is very individual oriented. How do you bring in justice to a community level, tolerance in a community level, is by understanding. So that is why I think awareness is very, very important. So correction of any system or an individual cannot happen just by a capital punishment or by any kind of retributive justice way of looking at the crime, but it is by awareness, by enlightenment. So when we talk about awareness, I think it's very important to talk about enlightenment. Basically, enlightenment is not just having an aura around your head. You might have, if you have a proper bulbs put out behind you or front of you, you might get a few aura. But I think it is really important that we move out of this unnecessary mystic definitions of human life, unnecessary definitions of mystic possibilities, but to come to, with all seriousness, to the idea of humanism. So humanism doesn't talk about aura or doesn't talk about your past birth and what you're going to be next birth. Humanism tells you how to be a human. No, that's not it. How to be a human and more than a human. So that is why people are now talking about transhumanism and so on. So where the individual cannot be situated in an Anthropocene. It cannot be just a mammalian memory which we are continuing to preserve the human species. It has to go beyond, I think, human life. And I think, I don't know whether I would have said this maybe 10 years back, or maybe when I was Anway's age, because I don't know what's his age, but I'm just assuming, means when you're much younger, we may think that the human species is very, very important. But I think today in this pandemic time, it's very, very important to look at our obsession with the idea of the human species and to think that life of human is the most important. I'm not ridiculing, I'm not saying human life is less important, but I think the idea of life has to be expanded in a world of coexistence, because we cannot guarantee human existence where the consequences of climate change is so much that it's going to alter all kind of ecosystems, let alone just the geospatial ecosystem. So which means, I think, what is our place in this universe? What is in our place in the earthly planet? So what is the nature of our planetary existence is very, very important. So moving from an individual to a community is not just done by just a lip service. It is by creating deep awareness of our nature as a species and also as a particular biological entity which can really go beyond its biology. What I mean to say is there is enough scope for human consciousness and human awareness. And I think it is only by creating that very, very deep transformative explosions in human consciousness that the travel from the individual to the community or from intolerance to tolerance can happen. Thank you.
Now,
Point.
I
Yeah, sorry. Unless so,
yeah.
could you close the panel with this?
Yeah. So actually, the question that you have raised is a very pertinent one, because we are nowadays, trying to think from the limits, right? So where do you locate the limits of tolerance? Of course, as far as intolerance is concerned, there is no problem, because there is no limit to intolerance. So that's the opportunity for intolerant people. But the real problem is faced by people who preach tolerance and who want to exercise the principle of tolerance in their own lives. Now, as you probably know, in certain circles, already people are trying to replace the notion of tolerance with mutual respect. But there also you have the same problem. Actually, if you try to override the notion of tolerance by using a term like, mutual respect, the real problem doesn't get solved. Why? Because when we are talking about mutuality, we can't really ensure that it's going to be mutual. For instance, I may be respectful to every religion, but someone else might not be respectful to my religion. I may be respectful to everyone's viewpoints, which is again a difficult thing, because as you have rightly pointed out, it's not really possible, probably, for a same person to be respectful towards say the belief systems of an extremely sexist person who thinks that rape is a justifiable act. It's really difficult to offer respect to that person. Tolerance, probably yes, if you try to look at that person from a very a different perspective. If you try to sort of heighten the level of your awareness to a level where from you can look at that person as a tolerable person, this is possible. This is possible in terms of rationality, and this is possible also in terms of a transrational kind of living, right? So it's also possible. But respect, of course, impossible. So how do you deal with this? And I think that is the central paradox that pluralism is facing today. And in fact, to this question, there is no answer. So this is what we have to understand, that we can talk about pluralism, we can talk about respect, we can talk about tolerance, but when it comes to the practical domain, we really don't know what to do. Right. So, for instance, as Mr. Menon has talked about women's condition in Afghanistan, we all know that that is something which can't be redressed with reference to, say, just mutual respect. We know that various types of atrocities exist in our society at the local, national, and international levels. When I talk about our society, I mean the human society, the entire global human society. And these atrocities exist because certain kinds of tolerance are there. That's also problematic. So tolerance can also be complicit in the continuation of injustice, right? So to be very precise, there is no answers, but yes, it is possible to look at even such people with empathy, not just in the sense of loving them, not probably in the sense of accepting them as they are, but rather in the sense of trying to understand what constitutes their psychological makeup. And we can also try to understand what has led to this kind of subjectivity formation, this kind of formation of a subject. This is very important. So the understanding of the prehistory, the contexts of subject formation, all these are important issues. And we all need to understand that every single person has a history in terms of the psychological formation, right? So that needs to be addressed. This is one thing. And secondly, when we talk about, this issue of sort of understanding the others, we need to understand, and the reason why I am continuously emphasizing this, even at the risk of being repetitive, is that whenever we talk about responsibilities, we often tend to talk about the responsibilities of single human beings. But you need to understand that responsibilities are something which everyone should share. If within a society there are certain people who are tolerant and certain people who are intolerant, then you can't say that tolerance is the responsibility only for one particular individual or one particular group. It is a responsibility for everyone. And this is an extremely important issue which we need to understand and we need to foreground whenever we talk about these things. Then the other perspective that I would like to bring in here is the issue of care. And this is again a hugely debated issue because many feminist writers like Carol Gilligan and others have talked about this. So that there is an ethics of care which is different from justice-oriented ethical idea. Now, I am not getting into the critique of this idea. There has been a lot of, a huge corpus of critical writing on this, and many people have said that this is actually a way of re-establishing the already existing gender stereotypes. But I personally feel that the notion of the ethics of care actually speaks volumes about the possibility of ethical reorientation that the human species can facilitate. And it's not just about women's ethics of care. This is something which men can also adopt, and this is something which men should rather adopt. That's what I believe. Because, whenever we talk about justice in very abstract terms, we often tend to overlook this issue of care. What kind of care you need to give, even probably to a criminal. Right. And if you look at the system of justice that we are talking about, the issues of judicial reforms that we have talked about from time to time in India and throughout the world as well, actually there has been an attempt to integrate this notion of justice with the notion of care. And as I said, it's actually very difficult. It is a very, very difficult job. I mean, to provide care, to provide, some kind of empathetic, love, so to speak, to someone who has done something terrible. But even that has been seen as a possibility, and probably, that requires a very different kind of awareness, a very, very different level of altruism. Right, a kind of impossible altruism, but that has to be popularized somehow. So that's why I'd say that when we talk about such, issues, which are always the exception to whatever rosy picture we would like to, conjure up as far as global sustainable peace is concerned, I think we have to again try to think about a possible leap from our rational framework of thinking, and also a leap in terms of emotion. Right. So probably there needs to be a kind of impossible leap in order to make possible a caring approach towards those who don't care for it. So that's really a challenge. This is a challenge, and this remains an open challenge for the moral thinkers, for the political thinkers, and especially for people like us who who are in literary studies. Because in the domain of literature, you will find a kind of engagement with these impossible contexts, this possible impossible contexts. So that's where I think literature has a great role to play. In order
I just wanted to add one line to before I forget that I think this is again from a response to perhaps what Dr. Anway was saying that again tolerance, it depends upon, some people may have tolerance for something and not something else. So it is not just a one straight line. So I may have tolerance for something, but I may not have tolerance for another. So it depends again, tolerance for what? So it is not, tolerance is just an empty box. You have to fill in. Then only you will know whether that box is enough, has enough voluminous capacity to hold what you are filling it. So otherwise, tolerance will remain a very empty box, which we don't understand what it can be filled with. So I think it's very important to understand when we are talking about tolerance, tolerance for what? That question I think is very, very important. Yeah. And I also just complete with one sentence that since I see the description of philosophy, bringing in philosophers to have this particular theme which you have started on this topic to end, I would think that philosophy has to go to the streets. Philosophy has to go to the roads. The problem with philosophers is that we sit in our armchairs in our classroom and philosophize. I think all this while it might have been okay, but it's not going to be okay. Philosophers will have to be on the streets. Philosophy has to know the pulse of the person in the street. Philosophy has to know the pulse of the person in the mountain. What I'm saying is not just the street or the mountain. What I'm saying is philosophy has to travel. Philosophy has to travel from a very abstract space to a very dynamic and happening space.
That's very true, because
Yes,
one of the things that I like about philosophy or literature is that the more I read it, or the more I watch it, or the more I moderate discussions, the more I realize that no one really knows anything. As Anway sir said, practical application may you sort of realize that no one really knows anything, and the more you do it or the more you consume it, the more humble you feel about how little you know. And I would like to I would get back to the professors, but I'd just like to briefly thank Professor Anway and Sangeetha here for giving us a little glimpse into how complicated this entire state of affairs can be. I'll get back to you guys. I just need to wind up with some announcements. The first is that I'd like to end with a reminder that telling a story is open for submissions. The story prompt is, as you may have guessed, Homemakers. If your story is good enough, it may be published via Amazon. The deadline for that is 20th September, which last I checked was today. So deadline's closed by tonight. Normally, and this is to my audience who have stuck with me for the last 14 or 15 sessions, this is the point where I introduce our next solo discussion, our next panel speaker. But this was our last session. It was an honor, it was a privilege, and at times it was quite intimidating to put together this mini lit fest of sorts. I have at times felt that I've been designing a course rather than a series of talks by important people than by thought leaders. Of course, a course designer is no one if they have no audience, so I thank you most of all for acting as my fellow brethren in the common search for truth. Hopefully, we have deconstructed homemakers enough to pose more questions than answers, and hopefully, we are not as sure of our own presumptions anymore. Lastly, of course, but not the least, thank you so much to our professors, Sangeetha ma'am and Anway sir, for making it today.
Thank you.
I hope this was.
Thank you, Neil.